Aristotle explains that not all plots are of the same quality. He divides plots into two types: simple plot, complex plot. According to Aristotle, a complex plot is far superior because it creates stronger emotions in the audience. Let us understand this step by step. First, look at the graph on the slide. The horizontal line represents the progress of the story, from the beginning to the end. The vertical line represents the fortune of the hero. At the top, the hero is in a good position, enjoying success and happiness. At the bottom, the hero experiences suffering, failure, or disaster. At the beginning of many tragedies, the hero's life is going well. But suddenly, something happens that completely changes everything. Aristotle says this change is what makes a tragedy powerful. Now let us understand the two most important ideas. 1. Peripeteia, reversal of fortune. The first idea is peripeteia, which means reversal. Peripeteia is the moment when the hero's life changes from one condition to its opposite. Usually, it means a sudden change from good fortune to bad fortune. Think of it as a turning point in the story. For example, imagine a successful businessman who owns a large company and lives a comfortable life. One day, because of one wrong decision, he loses all his money and his business collapses. His life changes completely. This sudden change is called peripeteia. Another example is a king who is respected by everyone. Later, he discovers that his own actions have brought disaster to his kingdom. His honor changes into shame. Again, this is a reversal. Aristotle believed that this unexpected change surprises the audience and keeps them deeply interested in the story. Now let us understand the second important idea. 2. Anagnorisis, discovery or recognition. The second idea is anagnorisis, which means discovery or recognition. This is the moment when a character moves from ignorance to knowledge. In simple words, the hero suddenly realizes an important truth that was hidden before. For example, imagine a detective searching for a criminal throughout the story. At the end, he discovers that the criminal is actually someone very close to him. That moment of realization is anagnorisis. The greatest example comes from Oedipus Rex. King Oedipus spends the whole play trying to find the man responsible for the suffering of his kingdom. Finally, he discovers the shocking truth that he himself is the person responsible. This moment completely changes his understanding of his own life. That is anagnorisis, when reversal and discovery happen together. Now Aristotle makes a very important point. He says the best tragedies combine peripeteia and anagnorisis at the same moment. This means the hero discovers the truth at exactly the same time that his fortune changes. Again, Oedipus Rex is the perfect example. The moment Oedipus realizes who he really is, he loses his kingdom, his happiness, and his honor. His discovery and his reversal happen together. Because these two events occur at the same moment, the audience feels intense pity and fear, leading to catharsis, which we studied earlier. Simple plot versus complex plot. Now let us compare the two types of plots. A simple plot tells the story from beginning to end without any major reversal or discovery. The events happen in a straight line. For example, a hero faces problems, fights the enemy, and finally loses. There is no surprising turning point or shocking realization. A complex plot, on the other hand, contains peripeteia, anagnorisis, or both. The audience experiences surprise, suspense, and strong emotions because the story takes an unexpected turn. That is why Aristotle considered the complex plot to be the highest form of tragic storytelling. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle preferred complex plots over simple plots. A simple plot moves forward without major surprises. A complex plot includes peripeteia, which is a sudden reversal of fortune, and anagnorisis, which is a discovery or recognition of an important truth. According to Aristotle, the greatest tragedies are those in which reversal and discovery happen together, creating the strongest emotional effect on the audience and leading to catharsis. This is why Oedipus Rex is considered Aristotle's perfect model of tragedy. Aristotle explains who should be the hero of a tragedy. He asks a very important question: What kind of person creates the strongest feelings of pity and fear in the audience? To answer this question, Aristotle examines 4 different types of heroes. Out of these 4, he rejects 3 and accepts only 1 as the ideal tragic hero. Let us understand each one. 1. A good man passing from good fortune to bad fortune. The first possibility is a completely good person who suffers terrible misfortune. At first, we may think this is the best kind of tragedy. But Aristotle says number. Why? Because if a completely innocent and perfectly good person suffers without any reason, the audience feels that it is unfair and disturbing rather than tragic. Instead of feeling pity and fear, they may simply feel anger against fate. For example, imagine a doctor who has always helped everyone, never made a mistake, and lived an honest life. Suddenly, without any reason, he loses everything. The audience may feel that this is unjust rather than emotionally satisfying. Therefore, Aristotle rejects this type of hero. 2. A bad man passing from bad fortune to good fortune. The second possibility is a wicked person whose life becomes successful and happy. Aristotle says this is the least suitable kind of tragedy. Why? Because people generally do not like seeing evil rewarded. Instead of feeling pity or fear, the audience feels disappointed or even angry. For example, imagine a dishonest businessman who cheats many people but finally becomes richer and more powerful. Most audiences would not appreciate such an ending. Sir Aristotle rejects this type as well. 3. An extremely bad man passing from good fortune to bad fortune. The third possibility is an extremely evil person who is punished. At first, this seems reasonable because justice is done. However, Aristotle says this still does not create true tragedy. Why? Because when an evil person suffers, the audience may feel satisfied, but they do not feel pity. And without pity and fear, there can be no catharsis, which is the main purpose of tragedy. For example, if a cruel criminal is arrested and punished, people usually feel that justice has been served. They do not feel deep sympathy for him, so this also fails to become an ideal tragedy. 4. The intermediate man, the ideal tragic hero. Now we come to Aristotle's final and most important choice. He says the best tragic hero is the intermediate man. This means a person who is neither completely perfect nor completely evil. He is generally a good and respected person. However, like all human beings, he has one weakness or makes one serious mistake. This mistake is called Hamartia. Hamartia does not mean a terrible crime. It means an error in judgment, a weakness, or a human mistake. For example, imagine a wise king who sincerely wants to protect his people. But because he makes one wrong decision, his entire kingdom suffers. He never intended to cause harm, yet his mistake changes his life completely. When the audience watches this, they feel pity because he is basically a good person. They also feel fear because they realize that anyone can make a similar mistake. This combination of pity and fear leads to catharsis, which is Aristotle's goal in tragedy. The greatest example is King Oedipus. Oedipus is brave, intelligent, and responsible. He genuinely wants to save his kingdom. But because of his ignorance and his tragic error, he discovers that he has unknowingly fulfilled a terrible prophecy. His downfall is caused not by evil, but by Hamartia, his tragic mistake. That is why Aristotle considers Oedipus the perfect tragic hero. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that Aristotle rejects heroes who are completely good or completely evil. Instead, he chooses the intermediate man as the ideal tragic hero. This hero is noble and respected but has a hamartia, or tragic flaw, which leads to his downfall. Because his suffering is caused by a human mistake rather than wickedness, the audience feels both pity and fear, and these emotions finally produce catharsis. This is why Aristotle believed that the intermediate man, like Oedipus, is the perfect hero for a tragic play. Aristotle explains how tragedy produces catharsis, which is the final goal of every tragic play. Think of this diagram as a machine. Just as a machine takes something as input, processes it, and produces an output, tragedy also follows a process. It begins with a tragic event, creates emotions in the audience, and finally produces catharsis, which means emotional purification or emotional cleansing. Let us understand this process step by step. Step 1. A tragic deed. The process begins with a tragic deed. A tragic deed is a serious action that changes the life of the hero. Sometimes the hero performs this action knowingly, and sometimes unknowingly. For example, imagine a king who unknowingly makes a decision that later destroys his own family. Or imagine a person trying to help someone but accidentally causing great harm. The action itself becomes the starting point of the tragedy. In Oedipus Rex, Oedipus unknowingly kills his own father and later marries his own mother. He has no idea about the truth at that time. Yet this action becomes the foundation of the entire tragedy. Now the story moves to the next stage. Step 2. The crucial condition. Aristotle says that the tragic action becomes much more powerful when it happens between people who are emotionally close. This means the tragedy should involve family members, close relatives, or dear friends. Why? Because suffering between strangers does not affect us as deeply as suffering between people who love one another. For example, if two strangers argue on the street, we may not feel very emotional. But if two loving brothers unknowingly become enemies, or a father accidentally harms his own child, the audience feels much deeper emotions. This is because family relationships create stronger emotional bonds. Aristotle says that without this close relationship, the tragedy loses much of its emotional power. Now we move to the heart of the machine. Step 3. Pity and fear. This is the most important part of Aristotle's theory. A successful tragedy creates two powerful emotions. The first is pity. We feel pity because the hero suffers more than he deserves. He is not a completely evil person. He suffers because of a human mistake or tragic error. For example, when we see Oedipus lose his kingdom, his family, and his happiness, we feel sorry for him because he never intended to commit those terrible acts. The second emotion is fear. Fear does not mean we are frightened by monsters or ghosts. It means we realize that the same kind of mistake could happen to anyone. We think, if such a disaster can happen to a wise and respected king like Oedipus, then human life is truly uncertain. This thought creates fear, so tragedy makes us feel both pity for the hero and fear for ourselves. These two emotions work together like the two gears shown in the diagram. Step 4. Catharsis. Finally, we reach the last stage. After experiencing pity and fear throughout the play, the audience reaches catharsis. Catharsis means emotional purification, emotional cleansing, or emotional release. Think of it like crying after carrying sadness inside for a long time. After crying, many people feel lighter, calmer, and emotionally relieved. Similarly, after watching a powerful tragedy, the audience experiences intense emotions during the performance. But when the play ends, these emotions are released. The audience leaves the theater feeling calmer, wiser, and more thoughtful about life. Aristotle believed that this emotional purification is one of the greatest benefits of tragedy. It not only entertains people but also helps them understand life, human weakness, and the consequences of their actions. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that catharsis is not created suddenly. It is the result of a complete emotional process. First, a tragic deed takes place. Then it becomes more powerful because it involves close family members or loved ones. This creates pity for the suffering hero and fear because the audience realizes that similar misfortune could happen to anyone. Finally, these emotions are released through catharsis, leaving the audience emotionally purified, mentally satisfied, and wiser. This is why Aristotle considered catharsis to be the ultimate purpose and greatest achievement of tragedy. Aristotle compares epic poetry and tragedy. Both are great forms of literature, and both deal with serious subjects and noble heroes. However, Aristotle finally concludes that tragedy is superior to epic poetry. Let us understand why, step by step. First difference: meter and form. The first comparison is meter and form. Epic poetry is written in a single meter, called hexameter, and it is presented in a narrative form. This means there is a narrator who tells the story. For example, In Homer's Iliad, Homer narrates the events of the Trojan War. Sometimes he describes the action himself, and sometimes he lets the characters speak. So, epic poetry is mainly meant to be read or recited. Tragedy is different. It uses different meters according to different situations and is performed on the stage by actors. Instead of reading about the characters, the audience actually watches them speak, act, cry, and make decisions. For example, in Oedipus Rex, there is no narrator explaining everything. The actors perform the story directly before the audience. Aristotle believed that this dramatic performance creates a stronger emotional effect than narration. Now let us move to the second difference. Second difference: length and scale. Epic poetry has no fixed limit of time. Its story may cover many years, many countries, and several different events happening at the same time. For example, the Iliad includes many battles, heroes, and events spread over a long period. An epic can move freely from one place to another because it is narrated. Tragedy is much more compact and focused. It is written for the stage, so the action is usually completed within a short period, often about one day, or what Aristotle calls a single circuit of the sun. The audience watches one continuous story without long gaps in time. Because the story is shorter and more focused, it becomes easier to follow and emotionally more powerful. Now let us look at the third difference. Third difference: constituent parts. Epic poetry contains four main elements. These are plot, character, thought, diction. These elements make the story meaningful and artistic. Tragedy contains all these four elements, but it also adds two more elements. These are melody, spectacle. Melody includes music and songs performed by the chorus. Spectacle includes costumes, stage decoration, lighting, and visual presentation. Because tragedy combines language, acting, music, and visual performance, Aristotle believed that it appeals to more of our senses than epic poetry. It is not only heard but also seen. This makes the emotional experience much stronger. Aristotle's final verdict. Now let us read the conclusion at the bottom of the slide. Aristotle says that tragedy is superior to epic poetry. Why does he say this? He gives three important reasons. First, tragedy creates a more concentrated emotional effect. Instead of spreading the story over many years, it presents one powerful action in a short time. Second, tragedy has greater unity. Everything is connected to one central plot, making the story more complete and effective. Third, tragedy achieves catharsis more quickly and more intensely. Because the audience watches the events directly on the stage with acting, music, and visual effects, they experience pity and fear more deeply. Therefore, tragedy gives greater emotional pleasure in a shorter time. This does not mean Aristotle thought epic poetry was bad. In fact, he greatly admired works like Homer's Iliad. He simply believed that tragedy reaches the same artistic goal more effectively. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that both epic poetry and tragedy are important literary forms, but tragedy is more powerful according to Aristotle. Epic poetry is narrative, longer, and written in 1 meter, while tragedy is performed on stage, uses different meters, includes music and spectacle, and presents one focused action. Because tragedy creates greater unity, stronger emotions, and achieves catharsis more effectively, Aristotle considers it the highest form of literary art. This comparison completes Aristotle's discussion of the major forms of poetry in Poetics and explains why tragedy occupies the highest place in his literary theory. Aristotle explains diction, which means the choice and arrangement of words in a literary work. Earlier, we learned that diction is the fourth element of tragedy. Now Aristotle explains what makes language beautiful, effective, and poetic. Think of this slide as a language-making machine. Just as a factory takes small parts and produces a finished product, a writer takes letters, forms syllables, builds words, and finally creates beautiful poetry. Let us understand each part one by one. 1. The foundation: letters, syllables, nouns, and verbs. Let us begin from the bottom of the slide. Aristotle says that every piece of language starts with letters. Letters are the smallest units of language. When letters are combined, they form syllables. For example, the word poerai has 3 syllables. When syllables are combined, they form words. Words are mainly of 2 important types: nouns, which name people, places, or things. For example, teacher, book, city, or river. And verbs, which show action. For example, run, write, sing, or think. These are the basic building blocks of every poem and every play. Just as bricks are used to build a house, letters, syllables, nouns, and verbs are used to build literature. Now let us move to the next stage. 2. The balancing act. Aristotle says that a poet should use language very carefully. He should maintain a balance between 2 kinds of words. The first type is ordinary words. These are the words we use in everyday conversation. They make writing clear and easy to understand. For example, words like house, child, water, or tree are ordinary words. However, if a poem uses only ordinary words, it may sound too plain and ordinary. The second type is unfamiliar or unusual words. These include rare words, poetic expressions, or special literary terms. They make the writing sound grand, beautiful, and impressive. But Aristotle also gives a warning. If a writer uses too many difficult words, the poem becomes confusing. Readers may spend more time understanding the words than enjoying the poem. So Aristotle says that the secret of good writing is balance. A poet should mix ordinary words with beautiful and unusual expressions. Think about cooking. If you cook vegetables without any spices, the food becomes bland. But if you add too many spices, the food becomes impossible to eat. The best dish uses the right balance. Similarly, the best poetry uses the right balance between simplicity and beauty. That is why the slide calls it the balancing act. 3. Metaphor. The highest achievement. Now we come to the most important idea on this slide. Aristotle says, the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is a figure of speech in which one thing is described as another to create a vivid picture or deeper meaning. For example, if we say, time is a thief, we do not mean that time is literally a person who steals. We mean that time silently takes away our youth, opportunities, and precious moments. Another example is, the classroom was a battlefield. This does not mean there was a real war. It means the classroom was full of arguments or competition. Aristotle believed that creating good metaphors is a sign of true genius. Why? Because a great writer can see hidden similarities between completely different things. For example, only an imaginative person can compare time to a thief, or life to a journey. Aristotle even says that this special ability cannot simply be taught. It comes from deep observation, imagination, and natural talent. Conclusion. So, the main message of this slide is that good diction is not simply about using difficult words. A great writer begins with letters, builds syllables, forms words, and carefully chooses nouns and verbs. Then, the writer creates beautiful language by maintaining a balance between ordinary words and unusual poetic expressions. Finally, the highest achievement of diction is the effective use of metaphor, because metaphors reveal hidden similarities between different things and make literature more vivid, imaginative, and memorable. This is why Aristotle considered mastery of language, especially metaphor, to be one of the greatest qualities of a poet.